Just because you're trying to move yourself out of an international food system to reduce your own vulnerability to shocks of availability and price, that doesn't mean you can't face shocks to availability and price at home. If you are the place that encounters this kind of natural disaster, this blight in some of your staple crops, a flood, drought, etc., then your own supply chains are impacted substantially, and you could be less resilient if you're not integrated, at least to an extent, into international food systems.
Welcome everybody to another episode of Breaking Silos with me, Sophia Jamil. As mentioned in the introduction, this episode is done in collaboration with the East-West Center as part of the Spring Virtual Institute for their academic fellows under the Young Southeast Asian Leaders Initiative, or YSEALI. And this episode is the 6th out of 8 episodes that we're doing, which we will be exploring different issues related to environmental sustainability. And what's exciting about these episodes is that many of the questions that will be asked to our guest speakers are from the fellows themselves. And these are young Southeast Asians who are doing great work in terms of environmental sustainability, whether it be water management, grassroots work, and so forth. So I'm very happy to have with me today Dr. Jackson Ewing from Duke University to share with us some thoughts on how do we get to a better level of sustainable development in the world. Just a bit about Jackson. He holds a joint appointment as a senior fellow at Duke University's Nicholas Institute of Environmental Policy Solutions and an adjunct associate professor at the Sanford School of Public Policy. He works closely with the Duke Kunshan University Environmental Research Center and International Masters of Environmental Policy programs to build policy research collaborations across Duke platforms in the US and China. Very exciting. So thank you, Jackson. Please, maybe you could start with briefly telling our viewers a bit about yourself and how do you get into the line of work that you're in? Apart from the fact that we used to be ex-colleagues in Singapore.
Well, thank you, Sophia. That's, of course, the most important part of my biography is that we worked together for several years in Singapore. I'll work my way to that. I came to sustainable development issues from a background in political science and international relations. And during my undergraduate and then early graduate studies, I became really fascinated and confronted with demographic challenges of growing populations, of carrying capacity of key ecosystems, of our ability to meet our demand for new materials that could supply these economic and social systems that we have built up over time, and our ability to absorb the externalities of those activities, from the food that we eat, to the cars that we drive, to the homes that we live in, to the steel and cement that we must produce to build the infrastructure that services all of those different sorts of systems, et cetera. And this was in the late 2000s and early 2010s, when, if one can believe it, some of those demographic trends looked even more confronting than they do now, as far as our population growth trajectory and consumption growth and things like that. There's been a slight leveling since then, while those problems, of course, still pertain, and the climate problem in particular has gotten much worse since then. But that led me into wanting to really steer my career toward trying to be useful in my own modest way in thinking through and helping others to collaboratively think through some solutions, or at least some steps forward on acknowledging those realities in a clear-eyed way and trying to come up with some systems that could improve our ability to continue to develop and improve quality of lives for people around the world while not having runaway climate change and extraction of resources at completely unsustainable rates. And so that's where I sort of dedicated the rest of my graduate work and went on to do a PhD on some of those topics, focusing on the Philippines. Being based in Australia at the time, I quickly became really interested in how these issues were playing out in Southeast Asia, and hence the Philippines PhD, but also spent some time elsewhere in the region writing a few environmental case studies in places like Thailand, Vietnam, Indonesia, etc. And that is how I came to get a job in Singapore and working for the Rajaratnam School, which was, as Sophia, you know better than most, is a fairly hands-on think tank situated within Nanyang Technological University. And by hands-on, I mean that in our unit, we attempted to produce applicable, pragmatic research and have it actually feed in to everything from Singaporean domestic policymaking through the Ministry of Environment and Water Resources to regional forums, like multiple different streams within ASEAN, Association of Southeast Asian Nations, Asia Development Bank, and other Track 2 platforms. And so I learned a lot during those years and took some of that to my jobs when I returned here to the United States, and began working more and more on climate change mitigation, first for the Asia Society Policy Institute and now at Duke University. I've become quite interested in the capacity for markets to be steered toward the climate mitigation challenge. And so I'm involved in different issues around negotiating how markets can fairly be part of that solution set. Still focusing very much on Asia, not just Southeast Asia, but East Asia in the form of Japan, South Korea, China, South Asia in the form of India and other major emitters there.
Great. Yeah. I mean, just to build on your point about, once going from Southeast Asia and now back to the US and still doing work on Asia, have you noticed any differences? Like, what were there lessons in Southeast Asia that you learned that were applicable or not applicable to, say, the US think tank world or scene, or was something missing, or were you able to add value in certain ways?
When you're based in a region, or at least in my own experience being based in Southeast Asia, the granularity of kind of local knowledge is something that it shouldn't be taken for granted. And it was wonderful to be just daily interacting with Southeast Asians who understood their part of the world at a level and a depth that I would never achieve, but that I could benefit from being around them. And so that's a difference. We often find, I think, and this is natural, and I don't think is unique to the United States. We could probably say the same thing about Europe or Canada or elsewhere. When folks here look to Southeast Asia, they often do so through a more US-centric lens than what we might see from within the region itself. So that's one difference. What I have taken from that experience, though, more than anything else, was the things that I learned about the process of applied research and engagement. So, that was an earlier phase of my career. I was younger, as one is in earlier phases of their career. And so it was really instrumental for me to be attending ASEAN and ADB meetings, to be involved in Track 2 conversations with actual policymakers, to be challenged by some of my counterparts at the Singaporean ministries to be more pragmatic or really effectively answer the questions that were challenging them rather than the questions that maybe I walked in the door with, and things like that. So I've really tried to take those lessons forward on process, because I think that they're in some ways universal and really important if it is a goal to work in these sorts of ways. And that doesn't mean just in academia or the think tank world. I think that those lessons pertain if you're working in intergovernmental spaces in civil society or elsewhere. That kind of that model of engagement, or that sort of real active engagement with the processes that lead to outcomes is something that I hope I'll keep with me throughout my career.
Right, right. I like the point about the granularity of understanding the issues when you're in the region. And that's something I've been telling the academic fellows under this program, where as Southeast Asians, they have an insight that a lot of people from the outside don't have. And that's where they, you know, their value add is so important, and that's why their voices need to be heard. And I'm very happy you mentioned that, how it's important to have those local perspectives to understand the issues that the region is facing. So I mean, so your current work now is more related to U.S.-China relations in terms of environmental policy collaborations between the two countries. What sort of sustainable development themes or issues have come up in your work so far that have been most pertinent?
Yeah, thanks. Well, I guess I should clarify a little bit. Part of the US-China collaborative aspect of my current role is not necessarily looking at the bilateral relationship, although I do some thinking and writing about US-China climate cooperation, for example, or lack thereof under the Trump administration. But rather it is more building exchanges and bridges between the two countries for graduate students and for the different university functions at Duke and Duke Kunshan University, Duke Kunshan being outside of Shanghai. And so we are seeking through our graduate program, the International Masters of Environmental Policy, which is situated about 75% in China and about 25% in the United States as far as where the students actually physically are. But we seek to have a really kind of rich back and forth exchanges between the two campuses and between the really interesting people that both in the student bodies and on faculties and things like that are situated on those two campuses. So a lot of the exchanges center around that. It's been an interesting year for that, as you can imagine. While we haven't had nearly as much physical contact and essentially no travel because of the pandemic, we have had kind of an increased appetite for video exchanges, and now all of us are very used to just hopping on our video meetings and classes and things like that. So that certainly continues. On the content side, the US and China are the two most instrumental countries in the world for mitigating climate change. I think that there's little argument about that if we just start from their actual emissions profiles, where China is in the high 20% of the global total, let's say roughly around 28% at our best current measurement. The US is about half that, maybe 15%. But certainly as individual countries, these are the places where we ultimately need to see the greatest action, and also countries that have the ability to set some norms in the international system about our levels of ambition and prioritization around climate. And I think that was demonstrated during a relatively productive period in the mid 2010s, let's say 2014 to 2016, under the Obama administration in the United States and the continuing administration of President Xi Jinping in China, when they signed a series of 3 bilateral agreements that were instrumental in the creation of the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, which continues to really orient international diplomacy on climate change itself. So after a period of 4 years of inaction at the federal level on climate change under the Trump presidency, and a really kind of low level of engagement and deprioritization of climate in the international arena, while many things were still happening in the US domestically, they weren't really happening in that outward facing way. We're now again in a new period under recently inaugurated President Biden, when even though the US-China political and diplomatic relationship is complicated, to put it kindly, there could be the potential for a reopening of that kind of bilateral cooperation and a reconceiving of what I'm calling virtuous competition between the two to lead in the development and deployment of green technologies in a way that is competitive, but that is kind of a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom, and can help us to deploy some of these technologies at scale and more rapidly than would otherwise be the case. And that's where, some target countries in Southeast Asia, really all ASEAN member states, I think would ultimately benefit from the acceleration of an energy transition that in many cases has already begun, but I think needs to be sped up.
Right, right. On that note, of U.S. China being biggest emitters of carbon, you've been attending quite a few at the recent annual climate change meetings, the UNFCCC meetings. What's your sense and takeaways from these meetings so far? I mean, a lot of people will say it's not happening, nothing's happening. It's so slow. Is the process still relevant? And there are other processes going around, like the initiative by local governments to actually take action.
Mm-hmm.
Does the UNFCCC process still have significance? Your thoughts on that?
Perhaps I'm biased because I put energy into it, and so by extension, I do believe in the process and the relevance of the process. So my answer is yes, and I'll try to defend that. I should say, first of all, I've been attending the COPs. So that's the COP stands for Conference of the Parties of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. That's just the beginning of the very awkward acronyms that really extend throughout the climate diplomacy apparatus. One of the reasons that some people find it overly bureaucratic and complicated and almost impenetrable in trying to understand it. All criticisms that I think are understandable and valid in their own ways. But I began in COP13 in 2007, which was actually held in Bali in Indonesia. And back then, the focus was quite directed in a laser-like fashion towards trying to put a new agreement in place that would replace what was then kind of the Paris Agreement of the day, that called the Kyoto Protocol, which was governing our efforts to collectively mitigate climate change and to a lesser extent facilitate funding for adaptation to climate change itself, although much of that work happened outside of that particular protocol itself and had been building over the years prior. But the Kyoto enforcement phase was soon to run out. And so the idea was that in a couple of years into the future, at the negotiations in Copenhagen, that we, the international community, would put new systems into place that would replace that, and that would put us in kind of our next generation, our new track of climate change diplomacy. And so the years prior, and I think this is sometimes misunderstood by folks who aren't involved or specializing on this issue, but we're really building towards that. So COPs, these negotiations have kind of a natural pattern that seems to repeat itself, where every roughly 5 years there'll be a major COP where a lot of the most difficult decisions are taken. And the years leading up to that are really about building the foundation towards making those decisions. And so, long story short, ultimately, the conference in Copenhagen, while doing some important things, failed to live up to the expectations of many, if not most, of those involved in observing those processes. And that relative failure or shortcoming has put us on a new track. And the primary characteristic of that new track is that we no longer have as divided a system between developed, called Annex 1 countries in climate speak, and developing, called non-Annex 1, in which the developing Annex 1 countries had climate change mitigation commitments, that is, commitments to reduce their greenhouse gas emissions at determined levels by the diplomatic process, and developing countries did not. They had their own responsibilities, but those were fairly loosely defined. And this kind of dual track had existed really since the earliest days of climate negotiations, and was understandable in the sense that culpability for the climate change problem lies primarily with countries that have been through the industrialization process already. Those countries tend to be wealthier, so they have a better capacity to deal with adapting to climate change, with sharing technologies and funding to help less fortunate countries and people adapt and mitigate. And so there's certainly a logic behind that kind of dual track, but it created a lot of problems geopolitically and diplomatically. Perhaps greatest among them relates to what we were just talking about on the US and China, where the United States for years said that they would not enter into any kind of binding or substantial agreement on climate change if China were not involved as well, and China were not also facing its own commitments. They argued that to do so would be to put the United States at a comparative disadvantage relative to China and other major developing countries, and also wouldn't solve the climate problem because these countries had rapidly growing emissions, large populations, were industrializing heavily, and so it was essential to bring them into the fold. And what happened after Copenhagen is that we essentially not fully abandoned that dual track, but eroded the wall that divided developing and developed countries in a very significant way, and led to this Paris-based system in which countries all bring their own voluntary commitments to the international climate effort of their own making. And the process of negotiating future steps is one of largely accounting for the collective impact of all of those different voluntary contributions, and trying to determine scientifically where those commitments, if they are all met, put us on a track as far as temperature increases and climate impact. And then through these regular meetings and a good deal of diplomatic peer pressure, try to encourage countries and facilitate countries increasing the ambition of those commitments over time. And that can be done in kind of a quid pro quo, tit for tat. All right, I'll reduce mine by this much by this year, but I want you to do this much by that year. I'll do mine if you do yours. That's a crude way of putting it, but I think not too far from the truth. As well as more kinds of material exchanges that can say, you have this conditional set of commitments. We will provide you with funding or support or collaborative actions that can help build your own capacity, your own ability to transition in these energy or industrial or transportation systems, for example. And we would like to see you increase your commitments and in a way that's commensurate with that, and that maybe is facilitated by that. Again, that's kind of a crude description. It's more complicated than that, but that's exactly the sort of practice that is going on, and that does happen to a certain extent through those international diplomatic processes. Now, I know I've given you more than you've asked for. Let me just finish here on this question. You mentioned, does any of this matter? It's been very slow. It's been plodding. It's been kind of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, to put it kindly. It's very specific and niche in the sense that there's almost UNFCCC proceedings have almost their own language. So it's not always that digestible to the general public or even to civil society, other than those organizations that are intimately involved, which there are many. And there's plenty of things happening outside of this process. There's all sorts of local action. There's all sorts of, passionate civil society activity to, really impressive and encouraging technology developments, public-private partnerships and just private sector innovation, et cetera. There are market signals that are not beholden to the UNFCCC process, but have a big impact on climate. If all major financial institutions start divesting from coal, for example, that's arguably a bigger deal in a given year than what might happen in a UN negotiation. But I still think it's relevant for some of the functions that I've already mentioned. But just to add to that, when we think of the counterfactual of it not existing, of us not having a collaborative process in the international arena to discuss and come to agreements about mitigating and adapting to climate change, that's a world that I find much more confronting than the one that we have, which, imperfect though it is, does provide that platform. And I do think it's an important one. And I encourage the young scholars that are interested in climate to look for ways to be involved in those processes. There are large presences of all sorts of different stakeholders in these conferences of parties, not just folks who are actively involved in the negotiations. So there are really interesting, they call side events. That's hundreds and hundreds of different talks about climate. There are major civil society demonstrations and activities. There's very wonky civil society stuff that's trying to actually help author agreements on problems and work really closely with negotiators. And then there are the folks outside holding up signs and shaking fists. And those people are really important for, I think, keeping the pressure on, for helping to shape the narrative around the urgency of climate, and have been really instrumental in some of our key goals, like keeping temperature increases below 2 degrees centigrade, making every effort to have that be 1.5 degrees centigrade above pre-industrial levels. So that kind of civil society pressure has been really important. So there's room to get involved.
Right. I guess that the takeaway there, I would say, is that while the formal process itself might have its shortcomings, the side events and other activities that are happening around it provide an opportunity for all the other stakeholders to get involved in different ways, whether it be also, startups promoting their technology and finding stakeholders that might be interested in investing in, so to say.
That's certainly true. Yes.
Yeah, right. Maybe we'll take a few questions from our fellows. They've been doing a bit of reading on different aspects of sustainable development. We have a question from Nachaya from Thailand. She says, the idea in the article, abundance, not sustainability, is really compelling. I also experienced the negative impact of the vagueness and uncertainty of the word sustainable development. Do you think what should be done to change the situation? What do you think should be done to change the situation? Should we clarify the word sustainable more, or should we set a clearer goal or process for sustainable development, etc.?
It's a great question. I fear I don't have the best answer. So if we go back to the source of where sustainable development as a concept really took hold in our collective consciousness and in our policymaking at domestic and international levels, So back to the Our Common Future report, I believe in 1987, that happened collaboratively through the UN process. But I think, certainly if we can go back to much older philosophical traditions to find the roots of sustainable development, both in the East and the West, it's the compelling aspect of it, the most compelling and most important aspect of it, to my mind, is how intergenerational it is. When we think about environmental externalities, we often think about them in real time. So, if we're burning coal to run our steel and factories and power our homes and buildings, then there's an externality to that. There's a set of externalities to that in the form of conventional particulate pollution that's going to cause smog and health problems. And there's an externality in terms of greenhouse gases that heat the planet. But there are also externalities that aren't affecting us right now. Greenhouse gases are actually a good example of that, but will affect generations that come, generations in the future. And this is something that we're all born into. We are facing the externalities of the past and the system developments of the past, just like our children are and will be, and generations to come beyond that. And what sustainable development does is try to integrate that intergenerational consideration into our current planning in a very, very overt and a very specific and a very deliberate, well, I shouldn't say specific, I take that back, a very deliberate way. It tries to make that a focus area. And I think that's really important because while we've long engaged in kind of forward planning, certainly, I mean, no one's building a railroad without thinking about what the railroad's going to be used for years into the future. I think that really asking ourselves about intergenerational justice and efficacy in decision making is something that concepts of sustainable development can really comment on and can really influence and really are positioned to address. So conceptually, I find there to be value in that. Now, I sympathize with the questioner's frustrations about how widely the concept is used to the point of being vague and to being able to be sort of deployed in a fairly generic way that can erode its weight and its heft. And so I think, and that includes, the ways that people wield terms sustainable development and sustainability slightly differently. And we could even add perhaps to those terms in this kind of larger grouping of language that can lead to some confusion about what I really mean when I say sustainable development. As far as plans and policies, my take on that is at the international level, we have the Sustainable Development Goals, and for all of their sins, there's a lot in there. I'm on public record as saying in a few different things that I've written, saying there's some overlap here. There's some confusion. For example, SDG 13 on climate, I'm not completely clear about how that is going to actually move our climate effort forward when we have this other set of processes that are outside of the SDGs. But I'm criticizing on the margins. I think that that the fact that the SDGs did rise to this top level of international prioritization and action is promising. And for all of the shortcomings of the past with the Millennium Development Goals, for example, the predecessors to the SDGs, we also saw progress that oriented around those goals. And so I think that it's a laudable effort to place those sorts of kinds of things to chase towards, of in the ground, that this often in quantitative terms is where we hope we can be collectively by this date. I do see value in that, having that lead some processes. Domestically and locally, I think it's really about trying to think of pragmatic, real-time ways to apply this kind of core intergenerational concept into our thinking. So there are very technical but clever ways of doing that, like applying a social cost of carbon, for example, into all of our activities that say, what will this emission or set of emissions that comes from this activity cost future generations? What is it going to cost them? And the number that you get is imperfect. It's not going to be exactly right, and it is going to be based on a number of assumptions and different mathematical techniques. But it's an effort. It's at least trying to acknowledge that there is a cost, which for most of the history of our industrial civilization, we've ignored. And so using sustainable development as a tool to stop ignoring what these externalities are going to be doing to or meaning for future generations is I think, its greatest value.
Right. Yeah, I definitely agree. The sustainable development goals at least gives people those targets of what should be achieved. And the question is, how can you apply those in your, at the national or regional level? That takes a lot more thinking and, coordination. But those are the goals that I think would already help address a lot of problems at the ground level. Um, yeah. We have a question from Feliciana from Timor-Leste. I would like to know your opinion on carbon sequestration, considering the benefits when injecting CO2 to gas wells. The injected CO2 may help in bringing out any trapped dry gas, which can be sold for energy. Additionally, this process can reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and can also bring economic benefits to the country. Do you think carbon sequestration is sustainable?
So the questioner asks about one particular part of carbon sequestration, which has to do with enhanced oil and gas recovery. The question there is I think the question on sustainability in that instance is certainly a difficult one in this sense. We are on a track to continue to use fossil fuels into the foreseeable future. The idea that we are going to tomorrow stop using fossil fuels because clearly they're problematic for our global environment is unrealistic. It will take longer to transition away from fossil fuels than that kind of immediate rollback. And so if you're looking at a particular oil and gas field, and this doesn't relate to coal, but I do put coal in a different category as something that we do need to essentially move away from in the almost immediate future. But oil and gas certainly are going to be part of our energy mix for years to come. And that's by our, I mean energy mixes around the world. And so if you look at a particular oil or gas field and you say, well, we're going to need some of this. We recognize we need to curtail our use and phase it out in favor of other energy sources over time. But we need some of these resources to get there. And we can enhance our recovery efficiency by pushing some of the carbon that we've captured into those wells to make that recovery more available to us and actually more easy. Well, excuse me, wrong word. And make it more efficient, we'll say, and also sequester carbon underground, where it's no longer going to be affecting our atmosphere in that same process. Then that could be better than the status quo, right? So it could be sustainable in the sense that if we're moving from just emitting that carbon into the atmosphere, having to use more effort to extract this fossil fuels from the ground and doing that in a less efficient, higher emitting way, then that is a less sustainable approach than capturing and pushing underground those emissions while we get the oil and gas out of the ground through other means. So relative to that, then yes, that's a sustainable activity. The criticism is that why should we be developing these new systems for cleverly getting oil and gas out of the ground? We need to be leaving more of that in the ground. So to suggest that it's, the time for enhanced oil and gas recovery is misguided, and we need to deploy finite resources toward improving our penetration of solar and wind capability, our ability to store the energy that we gather from solar and wind and transmit it long distances efficiently and power the kind of next generation of energy revolution. I think reasonable people can disagree on that. I fall somewhere probably close to the middle, where I could see some of that enhanced oil recovery with carbon capture, oil and gas recovery with carbon capture, as being part of the solution, but it shouldn't be something that is a large bet, because it would come at the expense of some of those other actions that are needed. But on a more broad level, you have all sorts of different approaches to carbon capture, utilization, and sequestration that are likely to be part of the climate mitigation equation. I mean, on its most basic level, carbon sequestration can happen biologically through clever use of soils and agriculture, and also forests, planting trees, preserving trees that do exist, etc. Those are wonderful carbon sinks, managing carbon sinks and sequestration through oceans, bodies of water, etc. Part of that equation too. But usually what we're talking about is more capturing our emissions themselves and either using them to make a product. Some of these captured compounds can be used to make things like cement, or as a component part of a given product, or sequestering them underground. At this point, the primary critique is, the primary critiques to that are one, it's quite expensive. Two, there's a moral hazard to giving the signal to fossil fuel communities that they can just continue their operations. We'll just be able to capture the emissions and store them. And so there's not really a problem, and that can reduce the impetus for moving into those new arenas. And the seismic problems that can come with disturbing those underground environments, potential for polluting underground water resources as a part of that, et cetera. The upshot there, to my opinion, is that for some places, injecting these emissions underground might make sense. For other places, it will be problematic. And for other places still, just as far as the inescapable geology of the location, it will be impossible. So I would see CCUS, carbon capture, utilization, and storage as a potentially valuable part of the puzzle toward mitigating climate. But I would hope that it doesn't become really one of the pillars of our response approach. Yeah,
I don't see that happening in Southeast Asia. I mean, you already talk about the cost, high cost, the financial sustainability of this project, is just too much for most of the Southeast Asian countries. And when you talk about the seismic, challenges that, geological challenges that a lot of these countries face. I mean, Indonesia, for one, there's so many earthquakes and sort of things. So to me, these sort of big tech solutions don't really have a place in much of Southeast Asia.
Well, so you bring up something that I think is important, and I'm going to disagree with you a little on big tech, which will be fun. We can argue like we used to when we worked together in Singapore. So I love the framing there, which I think is really vital, which is that all of these mitigation, in particular solutions, are choices. And again, we're always dealing in an environment of finite solutions. So it's about where you're going to make your bet, where you're going to deploy your resources. You can't say, I'm going to deploy them substantially to CCUS so that I can perpetuate my coal-based system in Indonesia, without the mitigation output. And I'm also going to deploy large scale offshore wind. And I'm also going to use my already scarce land to produce large solar arrays. And I'm also going to do distributed solar at village levels. And I'm also going to, be more self-sufficient in agriculture. And I'm also going to continue my moratoria on forest clearing and keep all my forests intact. There are choices. There are always choices on how you're going to use finite land resources, how you're going to use finite financial resources, logistical resources, and how you're managing these changes. And the changes are always coming. So I agree with you in the case of CCUS. And let's use Indonesia as an example. I mean, is this really where their large resource deployment should focus on perpetuating a coal-based industrial sector through sequestering carbon underground at great expense? I agree. I hope that's not the direction that is taken. But I don't lump all of big tech into that. I think that I think that while distributed energy systems are very important at household levels and at community levels, and can help us skip in many locations high emissions phases that have created this problem to begin with, largely from industrialized countries. That we do need some big tech solutions to get the levels of development that we need to improve qualities of life for a lot of these folks who live in these developing countries in particular. So I think large scale solar, large scale wind with major storage, high tech, ultra high voltage distribution lines that mean that we can take that power long distances to from where it's produced to where it's needed. I think things like large scale solar arrays in places that don't have strong land use potential otherwise, like the deserts of northern Australia, servicing large populations in Indonesia, that's a highly technical approach, but I think a potentially valuable one. So the use of renewables to create hydrogen that has this very versatile ability to power everything from homes to buildings to factories to cars. These are things that I do think we need.
Okay, let's take another question from Kyra. Let's take another question from our fellows. Kyra from Indonesia. She says, as I read the article about eco-modernism, there's a pessimistic conclusion I could take from the opening paragraphs, that the more prosperous humanity is, the more devastating the environment would be. Resource scarcity would deplete the human population, but the graphs would increase again as humans find other resources to exploit. With current situations, underdeveloped countries are starting to face the scarcity. Most of these countries alternatively import staples, plummeting farmers' prices, and simultaneously their welfare. It is difficult to change a nation's way of handling things, but do you think underdeveloped countries would face resource scarcity and population depletion due to importing food?
So that's a difficult question. I think we should start with the status quo, that we haven't seen that kind of population decline in developing countries to date, including through periods of fairly radical environmental destruction in some instances, and resource depletion. We have seen declines and kind of flattenings of quality of life in some instances, but even there, our trajectory has largely, if insufficiently, been on an upward direction in terms of just aggregate things like increased life expectancy, declines in infant mortality rates, the public health benefits that can come from progressively developing trends in the global system that trickle down to some of those developing populations. I don't mean to suggest that things are going particularly well. I just mean that we haven't seen environmental decline lead to the kinds of overrunning of our carrying capacity for populations that lead to that sort of population decline that the questioner mentions yet. And I tend to not sign up for the dystopian view that that's necessarily the direction that we're heading. You know, a much more relevant factor on population dynamics is fertility rates. That's ultimately, you know, what drives our population growth in many developing countries, and what is slowing and reversing population growth in many developed. And similarly, when we think about environmental action, we often see what's sometimes called the environmental Kuznets curve, a trend in which as a country or society or community becomes wealthier, their population becomes more likely to concern itself with environmental challenges because its basic needs for food and shelter and the everyday necessities of life are increasingly met. And so there's more space for thinking about, well, we really need to have better waste management systems here. We want to not be so impacted by our local factories. We want to, you know, have more sustainable food systems, for example. And so, you know, you do have that trend that sees environmental outcomes improve alongside economic growth. And I think that's a very real thing. The problematic issue that I think is implied in this question that comes alongside some of those improvements is that in our globalized economy, we can still import products internationally that have that kind of localized environmental impact where they are extracted or developed, and that the wealthier consumer can benefit from the good while not experiencing the bad. And that's where we really get into the need to clean up some supply chains to have stronger standards. And some of this has been consumer led, you know, to think about, you know, trying to consume products that don't have this really problematic social or environmental embedded activity. And so, you know, increasing those sorts of norms would go a long way towards addressing this problem. On the issue of importing food, you know, there are a few questions from the fellows that speak to food sovereignty and food self-sufficiency and things as a question around, you know, is this really the sustainable solution? I fully appreciate the desire of countries and of individuals to not be beholden to, at times, volatile or fluctuating international food markets, and to not be vulnerable to changes in including natural disasters or natural changes in food production places in the other part of the world. So, you know, wheat or rice prices skyrocketing because of a flood or because of fires, for example, that they had no control over, but that they are vulnerable to as a purchaser of that product. You know, I appreciate those arguments, certainly, that that's something that countries would want to avoid and would want to have more of a kind of a domestic system that can feed their own populations. And this has informed food policy in countries around the world for years and generations moving on. But I caution against the feeling or the position that full food sovereignty insulates you from those same challenges. If you are not integrated into, if you are trying to pursue a kind of full food sovereignty with few imports, or no imports even of key staples, there's a cost to that. There are a number of costs to that. One is that you are likely to be deploying a lot of your land to the production of staple crops to feed your population, and that's land that could otherwise be used for something else. In some cases, it could be used for higher value activities that could bring more money and more development to your population. There's a cost to that that's going to be absorbable by some countries that have really strong agricultural characteristics and plenty of land and water systems that can be steered in that direction. But in other places, it might not make as much sense. And in that, going back to that, there's always a cost benefit choice to be made here. It could make more sense to try to import some of your food products rather than dedicate so many of your own natural resources in that direction, which could perpetuate this low development level over time. And also, just because you're trying to move yourself out of an international food system to reduce your own vulnerability to shocks of availability and price, that doesn't mean you can't face shocks to availability and price at home. If you are the place that encounters this kind of natural disaster, this blight in some of your staple crops, a flood, drought, etc., then your own supply chains are impacted substantially, and you could be less resilient if you're not integrated, at least to an extent, into international food systems. It's not so easy to just kind of snap your fingers and say, okay, our supply chain that we depend on is no longer functioning in the way that we needed to. We'll just go get supplies from elsewhere. Sure, I mean, the system is fairly nimble, so there is some potential for that. But often in those instances, we'll end up seeing, the perpetuation of aid over long periods of time, real human suffering, as opposed in terms of food access. So there could be some real problems domestically that I don't think that just let's grow all our own food is this catch-all answer.
Interesting, because I think that's a good point, because especially when you talk about impacts of climate change, or whether it be flooding or so forth, people haven't thought about how resilient are your local food production systems.
Mm-hmm. Right.
So having that diversifying your food sources is potentially the way out.
Yeah, and I also think of this in terms of labor force and labor deployment. I think we need to be really careful about romanticizing agrarian systems, and romanticizing like a continuation of small scale agriculture that in reality has a very problematic characteristic of poverty perpetuation. I'm not saying that the answer is just to build a bunch of factories and manufacturing plants and move off from the land completely, et cetera. For many people, remaining really tied to natural systems and resources and land and agriculture is a really important part of social, cultural fabric and economic fabric. And that's a decision that should always be respected where possible. But when we see a lot of typically, I'll say, urban-based civil society voices, including those from the West, romanticize this idea of a more natural existence often in developing countries that will avoid this kind of electrification and industrialization of their society, that can ignore the fact that many of these agrarian families and people have very difficult lives. And we can look to urbanization trends. We can look to, the ways in which as countries get wealthier almost across the board, different times, different cultures, different circumstances, it's nearly universal that their percentage of their population that's involved in agriculture declines, and that there is some consolidation of those systems. Problematic though that is in a number of ways, including environmentally speaking, I think that that's a reality we have to look at in a clear-eyed way, is that if we do want to have this approach to kind of small-scale, sprawling, large supply in aggregate agricultural systems that can feed our entire country, then you're likely to have 40, 30, 40, 50% of your population involved in agriculture. And there's a cost to that, because there's no examples anywhere in the world of a country kind of reaching that sort of per capita development level that we would like to see, so that their health incomes, their health characteristics improve markedly, their access to education, electrification, all those things increase in the way that we want to see as countries move into middle income and full development. That hasn't happened with that amount of the population involved in agriculture in the past. Maybe it will in the future through some effective public policy, some effective civil society and community level action, but we don't really have a model for that.
Well, what about vertical farming? What about vertical farming where you're having, more produce in a small space of land, and also a controlled environment where you can control the temperature, control the water? I mean, wouldn't that be a possible way of not just potentially providing for local populations, but for export as well?
Yeah, let's expand vertical farming maybe to urban farming more broadly. I mean, vertical farming, I think, is great when you have the infrastructure there already that's going unused. Like, if you're able to adapt your existing buildings to facilitate vertical farming. If you're talking about building new buildings, with greenhouses on every floor, that's a heavy infrastructure lift. So that's going to cost a lot of money. That's going to have a large footprint, et cetera. But I think that farming in some of the unused spaces in the urban environment is really interesting. Rooftops get a lot of attention, certainly, but you see farming in the medians between highways in Hanoi, for example. Vietnam has as a country done some really interesting things on urban farming in some of those spaces that have typically just been relatively unused. And so I do think that can help you feed your population, which has a voracious appetite. You have this captive group of urban residents that needs to eat every day, all the time. And so, supplying some of that locally, I do think has its time and place. There are limits, though, especially when we talk about staples and grains. There are some carrying capacity issues you're going to come up against, and for me, I'm skeptical on things like rice cultivation at an urban level. This is just my position, because some very smart people would disagree with me on this. But I don't see it as being an efficient approach moving forward compared to using more traditional land-based approaches for your staples, for your grains, your wheat and your rice in particular. And we haven't mentioned any animal protein here, which is its own kind of situation that is not going to be met. So yeah, for leafy greens, I love it. For other things, I'm less convinced.
Right. That's going to be a bit of food for thought for our fellows to think about the relevance of agriculture. We've got a question from Sophia Roth from Cambodia. I'm very interested in food security. Cambodian people went through the Khmer Rouge and experienced starvation, and now we are facing a hard time with COVID-19. No crossing boundaries, and locking down in some districts. The rich go to the supermarket stocking up their food, while the poor hardly have anything to fill their stomachs. When we talk about food security, we hear about stocking food supplies, the growing of food, but we don't talk about don't necessarily talk about changing the way we eat. Why do we have to prioritize the preference in food security, i.e., preference, nutritional, and dietary needs first? Which one is more important between food security and food waste? Should we consider creating technology for food preservation?
Great questions. I don't have an answer of what we what the best solutions forward are on marrying preference to availability, other than to say, it brings into focus the importance of having social safety net systems, particularly for your least fortunate, that can be effective in times of disruption. I think that the questioner's point on COVID-19 leading to supply chain disruptions that are disproportionately affecting the poor in Cambodia is a wonderful illustration of how dangerous it can be to have these sorts of shocks to the system. And the pandemic is just one example of what a shock like that can look like. So their social safety nets for meeting basic needs is really important. On food preferences, it's a complicated mix of commercial marketing and preference development and the meeting of preferences through many times corporatized systems that are profit seeking, and they are seeking a return for their activities and are making decisions based on that rather than based on dietary health of populations. So, there can be a public policy role in regulating, some of the food standards that are required, not just for what we conventionally think of as safety, as though it's safe to consume, but other places have been a little more heavy-handed with that. Things like taxing sugary beverages, for example, and make them more expensive, with the idea that fewer people will drink them, and they will drink less of them. So you'll have less of the problematic health effects that can come from that. But there are also all sorts of education and civil society actions that can encourage healthier consumption and things like that. So I know that's a very incomplete answer, but a combination of I think social safety nets to deal with particularly emergency situations for the food security of the most vulnerable, and real thinking about how we can as societies change preference levels towards in more healthy directions in combination could do some good.
Right. So moving from Cambodia to Singapore, Mark from Malaysia asks, I'm curious about Singapore's food sources. I understand that buying groceries is expensive, but are there no community garden areas that can help supply to the needy? Although land size is limited, I'm sure there are a few areas where smaller crops could thrive. Such a nightmare imagining living off white rice and sometimes eggs for such a long period of time. I mean, there are community gardens, right? I mean, they've been having those since the 90s or 80s, but for a while, I think it just wasn't popular, but now it's come back into fashion, or rather it's become a priority to have that in some of the government policies. Yeah. Thoughts on that?
Well, there again, we kind of come back to issues of scale. If you take even a lot of Singaporeans, certainly a lot of foreigners, up to the northern part of the island, to Kranji farms and some of the other farm areas where I know you've definitely spent plenty of time, Sophia, they'll be really surprised. They'll say, wow, we didn't know this much farming was happening in Singapore. Those aren't community farms. Those are larger scale farms. And in fact, Singapore has moved to try to reduce some of its dependency on international food chains through growing more of its leafy vegetables. And on a few leafy vegetables, it it domestically supplies a large percentage of its market. And things like eggs, similarly, there is significant egg production in Singapore. There's some chicken production. There is fish farming on the different islands that Singapore has ownership or control over that aren't the main island where the population resides. There's kind of more going on in the Singapore ag space than meets the eye initially, but it doesn't come anywhere close to meeting the overall demand of.
Yeah.
We're
barely trying to meet the 30% by 2030. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. There's no you mentioned, the questioner mentioned land scarcity. There's no pathway towards, substantially more self-sufficiency on many of the food products that Singaporeans want to eat. For a population of its size, and I don't know exactly where it is now, with the food preferences that exist there, even if they were to change subtly towards more leafy vegetables, for example, still, you're not going to get there without importing substantial amounts of food. I don't see any change coming.
Yeah, and the argument is that the imports, for example, from Malaysia, are cheaper than local production. So that's something that's been weighing. Although the government is also trying to encourage urban farmers and putting a lot of money into it. But I think we'll see how it goes. In the mid 5 years or so, and see whether it's actually sustainable.
Yeah.
Hope. But at least I guess it gives that diversified sources that we previously talked about.
Definitely.
Yeah, so just some final questions, which I ask all the guests on the show. What does breaking silos mean to you, and what advice would you give someone who wants to break silos in addressing sustainable development issues?
This is a question I think about all the time in terms of, and I'm very conflicted about it, in terms of we recognize that we are facing with climate change and environmental sustainability this highly integrated problem set where economic activity, social norms, social and political and religious ideologies, technology and industrial policy, and all of these different facets, economic theory, all of these different facets of our lives, both as individuals and our collective engagement as societies and as political entities, intersect, and they all interact in ways that lead to these environmental outcomes, both positive, negative, and otherwise. So it's undeniable that this is truly an interdisciplinary, a conceptually varied, highly integrated set of dynamics. And it's important for us to try to understand those and to react to them in an integrated and way that leads to complementary and synergistic relationships that lead to positive outcomes. And silos prevent that. They have us look at problems through these different sorts of kind of myopic, tunneled approaches, where I'm going to look at the industrial policy part, I'm going to look at the economic theory part, I'm going to look at the kind of socio-economic, or I'm going to look at the philosophical or religious components here, and these silos can be really problematic. And I think that those silos have led to a prioritization of some aspects of modernization at the expense of others, that had we been less siloed in generations past, we could have avoided, and we could have found a more balanced way forward. So that's the argument, I think, a really important and compelling one for breaking those silos and trying to find these more integrated approaches forward. The reason I say I'm conflicted is that I find that to be not so simple. If we do try to look at every problem in a holistic way that takes into account all of those different qualities, characteristics, and components, and be, as comprehensive as we possibly can be, intellectually and practically, we quickly will get problems that are unwieldy and too complicated and too complex. And so there is a value at chipping away at particular aspects to a given problem. There is value at segmenting out different government ministries to focus on particular aspects of these issues. There is value at having different tracks in international diplomacy on climate change or water sharing or ocean management that are focused on particular parts of those larger problems, which in their own right are segmented from each other, even though they are connected and integrated. So we're always going to be making decisions on categorization, which in a way is siloing. So I think that's the difficult challenge that we're never going to escape from, that we're never going to solve, but that we have to try to continually improve upon. And so in that sense, I think trying to address aspects of a given problem or problems while keeping larger contexts in mind, collaboration between those different bodies and categories, collaboration between the silos, I guess, is part of the solution, but it's not simple. And so I think that's the rub. I think that's the challenge. And all I can really do to add value to this part of the conversation, I think, is try to explain my thinking on that challenge, because I think it's ever present and it's not easily solved, but very important, arguably the most important characteristic of the process level of how we move forward.
Yeah, that's a really interesting way of putting that, because you're saying that while we are trying to break silos, we also should be aware that we might just be building additional silos in the process.
Yes, well, I am saying that, but I'm saying something different as well, which is that a fully holistic, comprehensive, silo-free approach to complex problems is not practical. In fact, is not even possible in many instances. We can't have an approach to mitigating climate change that tries to capture everything, every aspect of that problem, every aspect of potential solutions, every source of those solutions from different disciplines, ways of thinking. I don't think that's possible or advisable. We have to have some comfort with segmenting out pieces of complex things, and so to acknowledge that reality while still trying to prevent ourselves from becoming truly siloed. A silo is typically this impenetrable concrete barrier around us, to take the metaphor forward. Can we have a more sort of porous level of categorization that allows for better, more effective interaction among different parts of an effort to solve a problem? I think that's what we need to keep as our goal.
Right. I like that, a porous silo where there is still communication, there is still interaction. That's a good point. Well, I mean, thank you, Jackson. I think you've given our fellows a lot to think about, literally food for thought. But yeah, thank you, Jackson, and thank you everyone for watching. I hope you learned a lot, and stay tuned for our next episode. And so from me, Sophia Jamil and Jackson Ewing, thanks for watching and bye.
Thank you, Sophia. Thank you, everyone. Bye.